All right, so we're going to be talking about CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. Can be kind of a tongue twister. Maybe try saying it 10 times in a row. But yeah, that's what CSS stands for. What is CSS actually used for? So back to our initial analogy. So we create our skeleton, which is our HTML document. CSS is actually used to kind of dress up the rendered version of that document. So CSS is used to design web pages. More specifically, it's used to define the visual presentation. So what I mean by that is the look and the layout for your HTML content. So we go back to our building a house analogy. I know I'm kind of tossing multiple analogies this way, but when we talk about building a house, our HTML is basically like the blueprint and the structure that we give to it. So like the walls, the floors, the ceilings, that is your structure. That is all HTML. CSS is actually, once you've built that house, how you decorate it. Like what color do you paint the wall? What kind of material do you use for the flooring? You might add a lamp or a sofa to a certain room. That's all what CSS is doing. It's just kind of the visual, kind of jazzing up the bare bones presentation of your web page. So again, adding paint, curtains, flooring, etc. That's kind of how you can imagine CSS. Cascading style sheets specifically are really convenient for creating a consistent, I think I have a typo there, or maybe not, a consistent style across multiple web pages. And we'll talk more about how you will kind of use cascading style sheets to accomplish that. All right, so again, CSS looks for your visual presentation, or basically your look and your layout of your pages. All right, so let's get some terminology associated with CSS. You will have a CSS document you will create, which will usually be separate from your HTML document. It doesn't have to be, but usually you will want to create a separate document. It creates or consists of a collection of CSS selectors. So that's the first buzzword we're going to introduce here. A selector consists of a collection of properties. So again, it's a bunch of properties. It could be one or more properties. And then a property, similar to attributes in HTML, a property is a name value pair that you're going to be using. All right, so just kind of understand what a selector is, understand properties, and understand name value pairs. So properties are consistent of name value pairs. Selectors usually will have one or more properties defined within them. Okay, syntax for using a selector. So again, this can be in your CSS document. You have the selector name. You'll have curly braces. So again, we've used this in Python and JavaScript, or more in JavaScript, but you have selector name, open, curly brace, then any number of properties. In this case, I have 2 properties, and then a closing curly brace. So everything within here is one selector, one selector object. Within that, we have properties. Again, the syntax for writing a property, you have name and a value. So in this case, the name here is property 1. You have a colon to separate your name and value. You have actually the value you want to give, and then a semicolon. So again, these are going to be really important, probably easy to forget, but each property must be separated by a semicolon. Okay, so this is a syntax. Let's actually look at an example. So in this case, the body is your selector. And we'll talk more about selectors in a bit, but basically that's just saying anything within the body should take on these properties. So this is saying I want my color, specifically my text color, to be whatever color this is. So in this case, it's going to be a dark red. If you've never seen hexadecimal format before, it's something good to get familiar with. Basically, this is one way to represent colors within CSS. So this is specifying certain properties for red, green, and blue. So this, again, that's going to be a dark red. And then you can also have a text aligned. So if I don't want my text automatically be, left aligned, by default, it's left aligned according to my browser. If I want that to be centered, for example, there's a text align property. Now, a question you might have is, well, how do I know what properties exist? Well, if you didn't guess already, it's going to be read documentation. So again, a lot of these properties will be common to different selectors, but just know that, there's no magic way of knowing what exists aside from reading up on it, getting familiar with it, and kind of memorizing it as you use it more and more often. All right, so again, just understand the syntax. You have a selector, curly braces, and then properties within those curly braces, separated by semicolons. And notice the colon separating the name and value pairs. Okay, let's talk about different ways you can incorporate CSS into your HTML document. There's 3 main types I'm going to talk about. There's the idea of having inline styles specific to an element. You also have internal styles, which is specific to your entire HTML document. And then you're going to have external styles, which is probably the most common way you'll see CSS used. And that's going to be just a separate document next to your HTML document. So let's see examples of all three. Let's go with inline first. So let's say I go back to my web page that I created here. Let's say I want to add some styling, right? Like I'm looking at it, nothing too flashy. Like I have text that's all black text. Some images, that's nice to have, but the font, maybe not my favorite fonts that I'm using. Let's actually add some styling here. So my browser has a default styling. I'm going to control some of it. So let's create an inline style. So my first inline style, I'm going to target my first paragraph here. Right, so today we're going to cover HTML plus CSS. Let's say I want to color the text of this paragraph and only this paragraph. In this case, I could add a style attribute, and then within this, I'm going to create some properties. So in this case, I'm going to go color, and then so VS Code, again, very friendly, will give you some predefined colors you want to use. So let's pick one. Let's pick dark slate blue. No, not my favorite. Let's go with Indian red. Sounds like it'll be easy enough to read, hopefully not too difficult to read. But if I pick Indian red, again, that's just a predefined color. If I actually want to see the value for it, there should be a hexadecimal equivalent, so RGB, it's 205.92.92. So that's another way you can represent color in your CSS file. Again, this is a function. RGB takes in RGB values. Again, normally you'll see hexadecimal, like DD, whatever. So that's also a color. And again, VS Code will kind of give you a preview of that color. So again, nice, pretty nice to use VS Code for this. I'll go back to whatever that name was, in red, sure. So now if I refresh my page, notice that I got coloring right here, and only for that element. The reason only this paragraph is red is because I define an inline style that only applies to this paragraph element. Normally speaking, you're not usually going to see inline styling. The only reason you might want to use inline styling if you want something super specific that you want to override everything else that might be being applied. Right, so I'm going to leave this in here because that will kind of play well with our future examples. But just keep in mind, usually you don't want to define style this way unless you have a really, really specific use case and you need to do it this way for some reason.
So that inline style is like almost like taking precedence over anything we would set in like a separate CSS file.
Yep, Sean's got it 100% correct. We're going to see this in play, but we'll talk about the idea of cascading in a bit. But yeah, Sean is correct. If you want to override anything else that might be applied to this entire page, you can do it easily with inline styles. But again, there are other ways to do this also that don't require inline styles. Let's get to our next example. So we talked about inline styles again. Rare to see it, it's specific to a particular element. What if I want to apply a style to my entire page? Well, one way I could do that is with internal styles, which is basically creating a style sheet within my page. And you could do that with the head section. So we talked about the head section, but didn't really add too much to it. I could add a style tag. Again, this is just something reading documentation. And within here, I could create some styling that applies to my entire page. So let's say I want, how do I do this? Color. Let's say I want to make this red. Oops. Looks like I'm not doing this correctly. All right, gonna look this up. So inline style attributes. All right, cool. Documentation, always great. That's not what I want. I want the style tag HTML. HTML style tag, cool. All right, so this is the syntax I need to follow. So looks like I was missing my selectors. So let's add that in here. So let's say I want to make every paragraph some color. So I'm going to do my selector, which is the P. So again, so this selector is matching a tag type. So in this case, this P is saying every paragraph here should have whatever property I'm going to set. Then we have curly braces, opening and closing. And then let's add a color attribute. All right, so let's say I want my color to be, let's go with, I don't know, a dark blue. So I'm going to use hexadecimal for this. And go 00, 00, and let's go, I don't know, BB. All right, so it's going to be some bluish color. get a preview of it here. Maybe I want to make it darker. Let's go a little darker. Let's go 9.9. All right, so I'm gonna get this nice, dark blue as my default text. So this is an example of inline style, meaning it's, internal style. This is internal only to this document. Let's create a new web page quickly. I'm going to create Tuesday.html. It's going to be a very, very simple HTML page. I'm just going to create a body. I'm going to ignore my header. I'm just going to put in a paragraph saying, this is for Tuesday. And I no longer like the name of Monday, so I'm going to go with, and rename this to week.html. All right, so let's say I want to see week.html. Okay, blow that up a little bit. All right, so notice that hopefully this renders correct well enough for you guys, but this is a dark blue now. I don't know if it's too dark. Let's make that lighter. Let's make that a bright blue. So let's go EE. Refresh. All right, so notice it's every paragraph on my page now has taken on this blue form. But notice it's only to my paragraphs. So notice that my headers are still black. Notice my lists items are still black, black font, but my paragraph, anything within a paragraph tag now renders as blue. However, as Sean kind of maybe mentioned, notice that this first paragraph is still red. Why is that happening? Well, there is an order of precedence here. So inline styles take precedence over internal styles. So in this case, everything in here is going to be blue, but since we specified with an inline style, for that specific paragraph, this color will take precedence over this color because both these styles are specifying color, but since this one is inline, it gets precedence over the internal one. Now we can still apply other properties that this paragraph will take. So again, this style is not the only style that will be applied. So let's say we want to do a background color, background color. Let's just highlight it. So let's do a yellow, 0, 0 or 1, FF 1. That's going to be green. All right, so I'm going to add like a highlighter effect. Notice I need a semicolon. I forgot that. Okay, so now everything in my paragraph should have a foreground of blue and a background of yellow. Keep in mind what's going to happen to this paragraph here. Question is, will it adopt this background color, or will this inline style that does not have a background color specified, will that kind of just like neutralize this background color? All right, let's find out. Let's save that, refresh. Again, my styling is getting kind of ugly, but notice that all my paragraphs have a background color of yellow. And this is a great way to see the block line element. Notice that this paragraph takes the entire horizontal space. Even though the text eats this much space, the paragraph element actually takes up the entire width. But the thing of interest here is this paragraph here. Notice it still adopts that background color because it kind of inherits it from the internal style, but it overrides the foreground color with its own color that we specified. All right. The final example is going to be external style sheets. Oh, sorry. There's one thing I wanted to show. So I did create another page, if you guys remember, which was called Tuesday.html. Let me bring that up. Tuesday.html. All right. Not a very interesting page, but this is my Tuesday content. Notice that it's still black. This is a paragraph element. If you guys remember, I created a simple paragraph element here saying this is for Tuesday. Right? This is a paragraph, but notice it's not blue, it's not red, it doesn't have a background of yellow because this HTML document does not have any knowledge of the style sheet in this document because it's internal only to week.html. All right, but the question is, what if I actually wanted to, have styling that's shared between two pages? How do I actually accomplish that? And that's with external cascading style sheets. So I'm going to create a new file. That's going to be called, nope, I don't want it there. I'm going to call it styles.css. Again, CSS is the way you want to, the file type you want to create. And this is where we're going to add our styles in here. So let's create our paragraph selector. And I'm going to add a foreground color. And let's say I want that foreground color to be purple. Or not purple, let's go with green. You can't use green anywhere. So I'm going to do hexadecimal, 00, dt, 00. That's going to be too bright for us. I'm going to burn my retinas. So let's go a little darker. Let's Let's go 99. All right, so this is going to be our paragraph color. Let's add a background color for good measure. Let's make it a lime green. You guys with me? Any questions prepped up? Okay, so I created a new CSS file or a separate CSS file called styles.css. I'm adding my styling here. Again, I have a selector, opening and closing curly braces, and then my properties I want to target. So in this case, foreground color and background color. So if I save this, now my file here, if I refresh it, still hasn't taken on that styling. And the reason is it still doesn't know where the styles are coming from. So this is where you actually got to tell your document to kind of incorporate some style sheets. So in my head section, which I failed to create for this file, I'm going to create a file called, what is it? Rel. I always forget this actually, to be honest. So I'm going to look that up. How to link a CSS file to HTML. I always forget the syntax, HTML styles. Cool. Internal, external. All right, so I'm just going to copy this and put that here. So in your head section, you want to create a link element. Well, link element's going to have a relationship or a rel attribute. That's always going to be style sheet when you want to incorporate a style sheet. And then you want to link to it. So notice that href that we use for our anchor tag is going to be used here also. So href, and I want to point to my style sheet. In this case, it happens to be named styles.css, but I could rename that to cool styles, whatever I want to name it. I just need to match that name. So again, we're importing. This is kind of the idea of importing as we did with like Python. So in this case, I want to use cool styles.css. Again, this file is sitting next to my HTML document. So I'm just using the file name right here. If it were within a folder, like let's create a folder. Let's call that styles. I could put that file in my styles folder, and now I need to link it. All right. Now that I have styles, like a style defined in my cool styles.css, and now that my Tuesday HTML page is linking to it, now those styles are automatically going to be accessible within my page. So now if I did this correctly, my paragraph should adopt the styles that are specified here. So it should be a bunch of green burning our retinas. So I save that, refresh this for Tuesday. Notice I got that style in here. Yep, kind of hard to read. Maybe shield your eyes a bit. But yep. So the question is, what happens to our week.html? I still have that up here. So let me refresh. Notice that I still have these yellow and blue paragraphs. Why is that happening? Well, the answer to that is because I have an internal style that applies to this page. So this style takes precedence over anything coming from cool styles.css. Let's add one more property here. Let's say text align. Let's center everything. So our paragraphs will be centered. All right. So again, it's a hierarchy, but they kind of condense down. That's the whole reason it's called cascading. It's like a waterfall, and they all aggregate together into one master style for each element. So in this case, if I add center in here and I want to link, I guess I didn't link before, so that already took away some of the example there, but let's add our link here. So I'm going to add my link. So I'm linking to that style sheet. And now if I save, everything should be centered. Notice that my paragraphs are centered. The reason being is because this external style sheet specified our text line should be centered. Okay, but these colors here are not applied because my week.html has decided to add those properties internally. But this is another important part. The ordering of your styles matter. So actually, if I took my internal style and put it above my kind of importing of the other styles, now whatever comes last gets precedence. So in this case, this line I've highlighted comes after my styles here. So it's going to prefer the colors from cool styles instead of the colors I've kind of hard-coded internally here. So since I swapped the ordering, this is now last. So if I refresh, notice we get these greens in here. All right, so if there's conflicting styles, whatever comes last gets precedence. And that is true for inline styles too. Inline styles are basically always last for each element. So notice that the text for this paragraph is still red because that inline style here is basically like the last style that's getting introduced to this document. All right, so again, we covered inline styles, which you probably won't see much of. Internal styles, probably not either. You want to get in the habit of creating external style sheets so that, again, it makes it very easy to apply changes to multiple pages. So if I want to change my style for both Tuesday and my week HTML, I could change it. Let's make it, not sure what's not going to burn our retinas, but let's make it white. Let's see how white looks. I'm going to type in white. Again, white is a predefined color name, so I could just use that straight up. Let's make this a little darker. So let's go with 005500. It's going to be a dark green. All right, so we're going to go with that. So now that I changed it in one single place, it should apply to my week and to my Tuesday now that I saved everything. So if I refresh week, notice I get, definitely hard to read, especially this link right here, but my paragraphs will now have a foreground of white and a background of green. And if I refresh my Tuesday page, notice that applies also. Okay, so external style sheets is the way to go, unless you have a reason not to. Oops, don't want to say that. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about, so we talked about inline styles. I guess that's the example I went through. So embedded is basically internal and external. You want to link to it. Keep in mind, you want to link inside your head section for external style sheets. Okay, let's talk about selector types. Again, a lot of material coming your way. So just kind of be prepared for it. Selector types. How do you actually target items within your HTML document from CSS? So we've seen an example of by type where we specify an element, in this case, like paragraph, we want to apply it to all paragraphs. So we did it specifically for that paragraph tag. There's also something called the universal selector, which will basically apply to every single element on your page. So I go back to my week page here. Notice that my lists never took on a style because I specifically said only for paragraphs. What if I wanted my list to adopt some of the styling? Well, I could do that via the universal selector. So I'm going to change the P here. I'm going to change it to the star, the asterisk. This means match any element that you find on the page. So if I save that, refresh this, okay. Notice that my lists are now centered. They're white foreground, green background. In fact, my entire page is green background now because my body, which is the top level for my web page content, that is also taken on a background color of dark green. But if I didn't want my body to have that, I could overwrite it. So let's say I do body. Let's say I want my body to have a background color. Let's go with a light gray. So do hexadecimal. We'll go with D. All right, so it'll be like a silverish light gray. If I refresh that. All right, so my body is saying, hey, everything in my body should be light gray, but anything else is gonna kind of take on whatever styles it can. Let's actually change the yellow, which I'm not sure why it did. Okay, so universal selector, where did it go? This is actually more specific, and we're gonna talk about precedence and specificity, but since I specifically said I want all paragraphs to have blue and yellow, that gets priority over a universal selector over here. Let me get rid of this page. So this is universal selector. This is actually coming last. Notice I'm linking to my cool styles last, as in second. So it comes after my paragraph selector, but this paragraph selector has a higher precedence than a universal selector. Does that make sense? So anything that does not have a style specified, it's going to default to this. But anything that has more specific styling is going to use that over this styling. So like, for example, my body here is specifying a background color, so it's going to override this color. All right, let's talk about more. This page is getting quite ugly, isn't it? You could also do it by class. So we haven't talked about classes yet, but you can get more granular. So let's talk about classes now. It's probably a good time to do so. Let's go back to our week.html. I'm going to create a class. So this is a little different than classes in Python. Basically, it is just kind of a way to distinguish something. So I'm going to use a class attribute and give it a value of whatever I want. I'm going to name this class, whatever I want to name it. So let's name this. Let's call it blue background. Right. So that's the name of my class. You can name it anything you want. Make sure it's single named, as you don't want to have spaces in here. So you can use dashes, you can use underscores. I'm going to use underscores. Actually, I changed my mind. I'll use dashes. So I think that's what CSS prefers. So again, the class name for this paragraph is blue BG. What does that do for my final file? Nothing. Nothing changed here. I'm actually going to get rid of some styling because I can't stand to look at this page. So let's get rid of my universal selector. Okay, that's a little better. Anyway, notice that nothing changed here. This is still the same because I've applied a class, but that class has no definition. So if I actually want to target multiple things, let's copy this. So again, classes, if you kind of apply some of the Python OOP knowledge, classes allow you to kind of combine similar attributes to multiple instances. So in this case, let's say I make our schedule for today. That's going to have a class of blue BG. And also today is October 25th. It's going to be class blue BG. Now, if I want to apply something to both of those elements, but not to every paragraph, I can specifically say anything with the class value of blue BG should take on some properties. So the way to select those class is you have a dot and then the name of your class. In this case, blue BG is the name I gave it. And now I can apply anything that I want to only elements that have a blue BG specified in their class name. So if I want to do background color, make it blue, as we would expect. Let's go with 00. Let's go with cyan. Hopefully it's not too bright. But now these two paragraphs, so this one right here, today is October 25th, and our schedule today is, those should override what they have right now. So notice the background for this is yellow. If I refresh, now it's cyan. Notice the one down here is also cyan because they have a class and we targeted that class via a selector. So this is a class selector. The way you use it, again, period is used for classes. So this is going to look for a class named blue BG. All right, so classes are kind of like general. You apply it to multiple items as you wish. They don't have to be the same type. So in this case, I applied them both to paragraphs. But let's say I want to apply it to a header. Let's say Thursday is also going to be class BG. Again, you can apply the same class to multiple element types. They don't have to be the same element. So my header 4 of Thursday is also going to be instance of blue BG. So if I save that, let's look at Thursday right now. Thursday is just a header. If I refresh, notice now it's got that blue background. Okay, so again, classes allow you to target multiple elements on your page with the same styling. Okay, they're a little more granular than just selecting, all paragraphs or all headers. Next up, we have by ID. So you can give IDs to your HTML elements. So let's target something specifically. I'm going to target filled with sugar. I'm going to give this element an ID, and that's going to be attribute ID, and you give it a name. So let's name it sugar item. Again, I'm just creating the name as I wish. Obviously, you want to name something sensible. So if I create an ID, I can target that ID specifically. So if I go to my CSS file, the way to target IDs is with the hashtag or a hash symbol. You type in the name. So in this case, it was sugar item. Let's make the color of that different. So I'm going to go color. I'm not sure what color I want. Let's go with dark. What will stand out? Let's go with dark red. All right, so again, these are predefined color names. So I could type in the actual color name if I want to use them. So dark red will be the color I go with. So go back to my page. So notice it's black font right now. Refresh. Notice it's now a shade of red. Important thing to keep in mind, IDs. So create an ID here. Where did it go? Right here. IDs on your HTML page should be unique, meaning you should never reuse the same ID for any other element. So I should not use, I could type this in here. I don't think that'll be an error. In fact, this might work. Yeah. So I happen to color both these items red, but this is bad practice. This is not the way you should be using ID within your page. All right. So both of these have the same ID identifier name, which is sugar item, but you should not do this. So this is bad practice. If you want a style to be applied to multiple items, that's where you should be using class like we did above. So if I wanted to apply, something to both these items, I'd create a class name for them and apply a styling to that class. ID, again, should be unique. Each element should have a unique ID if you specify it. Any questions on using classes or IDs?
So Anchor, besides the ID should be unique, is there any other difference between those two?
Not really. So ID is just like unique style you want to apply to one element. So, I created one what's it called? One selector here. So that's targeting one particular element. This is kind of the better way to go about doing inline styles. So notice here, I created an inline style. I'm doing the same thing essentially with this ID and applying a style to that ID. So this is the preferred way to do it in CSS. Again, you can create inline styles, but usually you're not going to. So in this case, I specified, hey, this element has an ID. And then in my style, I said, anything with that ID is going to have this color. Again, if you want to do it, like if you want to generalize or have multiple items, that's where you should be using classes. So in this case, I have multiple elements using blue BG. That's totally fine. But I should not have multiple elements with the same identifier of sugar item.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks for your question. What other questions you guys have?
Ankur, can you have comments or how do you comment a CSS file?
That's a great question. I don't remember it, but it is possible. Comments in CSS. Again, this is stuff you guys should be Googling when you guys get a chance, but how do you comment out of a section? Okay, so use /*. So let's say I want to ignore the style. You open it with a /* and you close it with a asterisk and /. You could do this for multiple lines. So if I had multiple styles here, that would all be commented.
Thanks.
Yep. Good question. Usually, again, you don't need to comment your CSS files for our needs. I don't really see commenting unless you're trying to describe something, but it is possible. Okay, let's move on.
Could I point out another use case for the ID that is different for the class?
Absolutely. Knowledge is power. Go for it.
So one of the ways that I would use the ID class is whenever we use like divs, or the way that I use divs, I'll use it for different sections within a site, right? Like, different block sections where like you'd have different background colors and whatnot. But one of the things you can do if you're ever making a single page, instead of like a multiple page website with a single page, with your menu, when you go to like your menu options, you can use the ID tag to actually go to that section. Whereas if you had the class, the menu wouldn't know how to specifically get to that one section, if that makes sense for everyone.
Gotcha. Yeah, again, we talked about divs. Again, divs are a great way to, again, break up your page and target child items, for example. So we're going to get to that. So let's continue on. We do have a few more things going, and I know we're running up against lunchtime. So we talked about selectors. Again, there's several ways to select it. You can do it universally, as in applies to everything, applies to certain types. So paragraphs, for example, and you get to create class names and element names. So that gives you control over elements. You also do it by attribute name. So example, if I want to do anything that has a width specified, I could target that specific attribute. That's kind of ignores, it ignores, what am I trying to go for? It ignores the type that it deals with, I guess. Okay, so let's move on. There's other types of selectors. We're not going to cover this today. Just know that they exist. These are a little more advanced. Might go over them tomorrow, but you could do it by locations. For example, if I have a div and I only want to target the first child within it, there's a reserved name of first -- child that will only apply to the first direct child of your div. You also, do a relative, so double colons after. That'd be like the sibling that comes after a div. Again, these are more advanced. Not going to focus on them today. Just know that they exist in case you need to use them. Okay. You can group selectors. So again, this gets a little more advanced, but let's say I want to target all paragraphs, all header 1s, and all header 2s. You separate them with a comma, and then the style that you apply will apply to every paragraph, header, and header 2. You can also, again, combine tags and classes. Again, these combinations are kind of infinite. So for example, if I only want to target a paragraph that has a class by that name, I could do that with a p dot and the class name. So let's do a quick example of that just to go over this. Notice if you remember for my week.html, I applied the class blue BG to my header 4 item, which is Thursday, and also to 2 paragraphs up here. So the result was my header down here is blue background and also these 2 paragraphs. What if I only wanted the paragraphs with that class to be blue background and I don't want any header to have that style? Well, I could do that easily by combining selectors. So in this case, instead of doing just blue background, I could do paragraph, that blue background. Now only paragraphs that have this class will have that blue background. So if I save that, refresh, notice that my header no longer is selected by that selector because this is a H1 with that class versus these two elements, this one and this one, are paragraph elements that have a class of blue background, which is exactly what my selector is specifying. It's saying, find a paragraph element that has a blue background class. So again, you can chain selector types. In this case, this is a type selector, and this is a class selector. Okay, so again, you should have the ability to target anything you want. You could do it by attribute. So anything that has an align attribute, for example, for a paragraph would be selected by this. You could chain classes together. So if I want something to have multiple classes, let's do a quick example of that. Go to my weak.html. Let me go back to this paragraph. If you want to apply multiple classes, you simply separate class names by a space. So in this case, let's say this one will be my other class. So say I only want to target this element via classes. I can do that simply by chaining those classes together. So I'll do this one. All right, so what I've done here is now this element has two classes versus the one down here only has one. This selector is going to look for both of these classes. It's going to look for this one and look for blue background. So if I save this, refresh, you should, hopefully won't be surprised, only this one should retain the style. Because the selector that I defined is not hitting this anymore, because this does not meet the criteria for that selector. Okay.
Ankur, just so I understand fully here, the P, whenever we're talking about, P dot, blue BG or whatever,
What?
For all those other things as well, that's only referring to paragraphs, right?
Yep. Yeah, this is specifically saying only target paragraphs. The reason it knows, oops, not sure what happened there. But reason it knows this is a type selector is because it's not prepended with a dot. If I put a dot here, it's going to look for a class name P, not a element that's body or paragraph. So again, the syntax matters. Hashtag means search by ID. Period means search by class name. And then lack of a period or hashtag means search by type, as in it's going to look for a paragraph element or paragraph tag. Yep, good questions. Okay, let's continue on. So again, many possibilities. You could chain things as you need them. You guys can explore that if you get into them. Let's talk about specificity, and then I think I'll try to wrap this up. So specificity is something we introduced a bit earlier, but the idea here is there's a precedence. And this is kind of like just a hack formula. Again, this is not precise. Basically, if you have a type selector, so again, something that is like paragraph, for example, that is a type selector. It's targeting all paragraphs. That gets a weighting of basically 1 in our formula here. If you have something that's a class selector, that is more specific. So if you want to see an example of this, let's create two styles. We're going to create a paragraph style and a class selector, which is going to be blue background. In fact, I'm going to switch the order of these just to prove my point. All right, so we have two styles coming in here. Both are going to specify a background. So let's say blue BG is going to have a blue background, and all paragraphs should have a, a dark gray background. I'm running out of colors to use here. All right, so every paragraph on my page should have a dark gray background, but anything with a blue background class should have a cyan colored background. Question is, well, what if these conflict? What if something is both a paragraph and has a blue background as a class? Well, what's going to happen? And this is where specificity precedence comes into play. So anything that's a class selector is more specific than something that's an element selector or a tag selector. So if I save this, I should expect that paragraph still to have that blue background. So let's refresh. Notice that, oh, that didn't happen. So I might need to bite my words, but so everything got a dark gray. Why didn't this get precedence is the question. I am actually wondering about that. So we'll come back to that, but there's also ID selector. So anything that selects by ID should get precedence. So we have, something called, there we go, filled with sugar. That should get precedence over anything else. And I'm actually wondering about this example. Is it because I have multiple styles here?
Your blue BG, it's an underscore in your CSS file, but it should be a hyphen.
Brandon, thank you so much. Yeah, sorry. I went with dashes, not underscores. So that was my mistake. So again, both of these should be targeting, are targeting the same thing. This element or this tag is both a paragraph tag and also has a class. The question is, what's going to precedence? And the answer is classes are more specific than types. So if I refresh this now, we get blue down here, right? Because in class selectors have a higher weighting. That's what these numbers are kind of signifying. Type is the lowest precedence, then class, then ID selector. So anything that you target by ID is more specific, so it gets a higher weighting. And then finally, you might have inline styles. Those get the highest precedence. So that's going to basically override anything that's being adopted from above. Key thing to mention here, these are not precise. This is not saying that 10 type selectors equals 1 class selector. It's just giving you a relative weighting. So just know that class selectors will override type selectors if there's a conflict.
Where does attribute selector work into that hierarchy?
That's a good question. I don't have that listed here. My guess would be it'd be between class and ID, but I actually have not verified that. So let's pretend that exists. Attribute selectors are more rare. I don't really see them too often, but that is a good question. So maybe that's something you guys can mess around with during your coding challenges for the afternoon. All right. Again, we are going through a lot. Let's kind of just go through the next few items. So these are examples. So example, you have a class selector that's based on our magical formula. That's a weighting of 10. Let's say you have a div and some class. So both these have some class, but this selector is more specific because you're kind of combining them. So you have a div, which gives you a weighting of 1. That class gives you a weighting of 10, again, from our formula here. So that's going to be a value of 11 from our made up formula. We can also do by ID. For example, anything within a div that has an ID is going to have this style. So that's a type selector and an ID selector, which is a weighting of 100. So let's say you have these 3 styles specified. This is going to get precedence because that's the most specific selector that you have. So that's a weighting of 101 from our formula. If there is a tie, so for example, let's say I have some class and then some class again, or let's say I have 2 classes. So let's go through that example quickly. Let's say we go back to our this one class, and then I specify I want to create a this one styling. So this one, what do I want here? Let's go with a background color of, let's just go with black. All right, so in this case, this particular element has 2 classes. It has blue BG as one class and this one as another class. So it's going to inherit this style, which calls for a black background, but then my cool styles calls for a blue background. So the question is, well, they're both the same specificity, right? They're both class selectors. The question is, well, who's going to get precedence? If I refresh this, notice I still have that blue background. And the reason is the last point here. If there's a tie, then the last definition, as the one that comes second or most recently, is the last definition to get applied. So if I swap those, let me actually swap my inline style and put that after this. Let me get rid of this so we don't confuse ourselves. Save. All right, so now this is coming second because I'm importing my styles above it. So this should take on a black background. Notice I get black. That makes it really hard to read, but that is the style I specified. So there was a tie. Well, then if there's a tie, we'll need to do whatever comes second. Okay, I'm going to skip over selector combinators, but this is just a more granular way to find exactly what we're looking for within your document. So you can do it, descendants. So again, when you have a hierarchy like a div and a paragraph that's a child of the div, you can target only paragraphs that are in within a div. Let me do one example just to make sure the concept makes sense. So if I go back to my file, we did create a div down here. Remember, we created a div that has paragraphs as children. So if I wanted to only apply styles to any paragraphs that are within divs, I can target that via a combinator. So if I want to do div as my type selector, but then I want to do children of a div. I think I did that correctly. Yep. So here I would do something like background color. Let's go with deep pink. It's going to burn our retinas probably. So we do this. Let's go back to our page, refresh. Notice that only these 2 paragraphs took on that deep pink color because that selector, that combinator said only target paragraphs that are descendants of divs. All right, so you get kind of complicated. You guys can kind of read up on this, but you could do immediate children. So this format will do grandchildren, great-grandchildren. The angle bracket will say only immediate children. So don't target grandchildren or great-grandchildren. You can do siblings via the tilde operator. You do adjacent siblings. Again, these, again, get a little more complicated. You might want to use them. Again, they're for highly specialized cases where you need to select something specific. You can also use a not. So again, if I want to target everything that's not a paragraph descendant of my div. So yeah, it can definitely get crazy. Definitely mess around with it and try to make sure you understand combinators, but it gives you more control over your CSS stylings. All right, last thing I promise, the box model. So the box model is kind of important to know how your layout is within your CSS page. So let's actually bring up our web page. Hopefully we had a good example. Let's go back to cnn.com. And this is something you can do, kind of inspect your HTML. So if I, for Chrome, let's go to Chrome because that's what we're gonna be using. cnn.com. Please load. All right, if on Chrome, you could hit Command Option I, and I'll bring up your property. Yeah, that should bring up your property inspector. I think my computer is lagging, is my problem here. So Command Option I will bring up this developer tool here. This actually lets you look at the HTML that your browser is rendering. So notice if I hover over something, it tells me what it is. So again, there's a lot on this page, a lot of scripts too. Let's see, let's say I want to find this. I could highlight it or right click on it, inspect. It's going to show me exactly in the HTML where it is. So notice this is in H2. Let me actually change my orientation. All right. So I'm looking at the source for my HTML file here. So notice this in H2. It's got some classes with it, whatever. So there's a lot of properties. Wall Street sends a clear message to Facebook. That's what the content of the H2 is. So again, you can mess around with it. You can actually change it, I believe. If I change this to I like donuts, hit enter. Notice I just modified CNN. Am I actually modifying the source? No. I've updated it locally. So if you guys went to CNN right now, you would not see I like donuts as the headline. But although that's a great headline, I've modified this locally. So what actually happened, just getting more into details, I made a request and I got HTML back that my browser rendered. Now, when I edit it, I'm only editing my copy of it. I'm not editing the source for everybody else who navigates to CNN.com. That's kind of fun. Again, you can kind of mess around with, mess around the page and change styling. You change content, do whatever you want. The key thing I wanted to show here was the box model layout. So go to layout. What am I looking for? I click on this. I think it's in layout. Yes, sorry, computed. If you go to the computed tab, again, there's a lot of tabs here, so understandable if you get lost. You should see something like this. This is the box model. It's pretty important to know as you're dealing with CSS and kind of laying out your elements on your page. There are 4 main areas that you'll deal with. There's content, there's padding, there's border, and there's margin. So the content is the main stuff that you're going to be actually inserting your content into. That's what this area specifies. You can optionally add padding, which is something that basically buffers your content from your border. So again, we haven't really used borders. That's another property you can apply. If you guys want to see that quickly, let's do border and then specify 2px, solid, and what? This should add a 2-pixel border that has a black outline to all my paragraphs. So if I save that, go back to my week. Notice that every one of my paragraphs has a black background, as long as that selector hit it. This header is not a paragraph, so it does not get a black background. But that is where your border comes into play. So if you specify a border to any element, just note that padding can separate it. So if I want to add some padding, let's add some padding here. So padding is a property for pretty much every element. I can add, let's grab my semicolon. Padding, let's add 8 pixels. Let's get some nice padding in there. So again, this is some buffer space that separates your border from your content, in this case of my paragraph. So if I save that, notice I get some nice buffering here. So whatever I highlighted here, that's my content area. This wedge here, this dark gray area is still within my elements, but it's buffering between my content and my border. Can you see that clearly? I'll blow this up a bit. All right, so that's content. This is padding. This is my border. Let's make that a little bigger. Okay, I think you guys get the idea, but I just want to show that a little more. So again, border, black line, this is my paragraph, and this is my content. The final thing is you can have margin. Margin buffers from the outside. So it's not actually part of your element, but it adds spacing between elements. So in this case, let's add a margin here, just to round it out. Margin will be 16 pixels. Let's make this a evident background. Let's go with bright, so bright color, light, with light coral. Okay, so let's kind of see this box model that we kind of developed. Refresh. Light coral. It's, I guess you can't actually see the margin here because it was added. Notice that these shifted, but the margin is outside of my element here, so it's not part of your element. Again, the box model is important to know about just because when you're dealing with layouts, you're going to run into it often. So kind of just familiarize yourself with it. Again, you can kind of explore. So this is not what I want. If I click on this, that's the image I was looking at. That's the content. It has no padding. So when I click on padding, I get no highlighting, has no border, has no margin. But, you know, it might be a better example, stuff that has border and margin. I don't see anything on CNN.com. But again, just understand the concept here of how an element behaves with respect to content, padding, border, and margin. And margins outside your element. Border is the thing bordering your element you would expect. Padding is what separates your border and your content. Your content is the main content of your element. Okay, cool. Key takeaways. Just wrapping it up. Know the basic structure of an HTML element. Again, that's something we talked about. An HTML element has tags, has an opening tag, closing tag, and optionally might have content. Understand the structure of it. So we kind of jump back really quickly. Escape out of here. Again, just to refresh the syntax of it. Again, angle brackets will open your tag and close the tag. Sorry, this is your opening tag. That's the one I wanted. Yeah, so opening tag, closing tag, again, / and the tag name. Then you might have content, but again, you will have a tag name. So you always start with a tag name. The ordering of this matters. I can't put href before it and put the A later. Like this ordering does matter in terms of how it processes this tag. So it always looks for a tag name first, then any optional attributes. Again, you don't need to have attributes, but you definitely might. And then you will have content in between it and attributes as such. Okay, so just know this basic syntax. Get through this quickly. Yep. Know the common HTML elements. Again, the ones we reviewed. So know, HTML head, body. Also know paragraphs, headings, images, lists. Again, you're going to see these often. So get familiar with them and how to use them and how they are rendered by your browser. And then we also dove into CSS. This is just kind of understanding what CSS is used for. Again, just giving your web pages some more look and layouts and styling to make a more interesting look at. Know how CSS selectors work. So again, that's the idea of we create a style sheet. We might have multiple styles defined. Understand how they kind of work. We can target items by class name, by type name. We can even do it by ID. Again, ID should not be repeated. So ID should be unique within your page. Again, understand by properties. The main other thing to take away is there is a precedence. So understand that the ordering of how you link styles can matter. So if there's a conflict, whatever is last will get applied, but also the specificity matters. So if you have a class selector and then you have a type selector, know that there's a precedence. In this case, class selectors have more a higher weighting or higher precedence than type selectors. Again, a lot of stuff to remember there. Just know that there is a precedence and get familiar with them as you are coding. Okay, and then applying CSS specificities. We talked about inline versus class selector versus ID selector. Just know kind of how to calculate which one has more precedence. Okay, that was a lot of information, especially if you've never coded or developed in CSS or HTML before. Definitely a lot to take in. The best way to learn it, as always, is to apply this for yourself. So let me pause the recording here.